Good morning, everyone. I've been asked to give my perspectives on the recent changes in the context of stability and complexity of the system as someone who practices it every day. What I wanted to do is to, over the course of the next few minutes, just give a bit of context to the recent changes in terms of the history and the stability, go through some of the changes in a bit more detail and work out what they might mean in practice, and also to think about the sorts of areas we might need to look at and continue working on. So I suppose first of all, just putting things into historical context, I mean, in many ways, the changes in 2011 and in the last 18 months should not come as a surprise. When you look at the North Sea tax regime from inception, many of the foundations we have in place right now were laid back in 1975 with the publication of the Oil Taxation Act, and actually that still remains in place and forms the large part of the oil and gas tax legislation. But one of the other points here is that the regime has almost constantly changed. So this timeline marks significant changes to the regime over time, changes in the PRT rate, increase, decrease, repeals. And it's a set of change that continues over the last 10 years with the introduction of SCT back in 10 years ago. I suppose what was perhaps slightly remarkable is when you consider that history is that we did actually have a period of 5 years between 2006 and 2011, which was relatively uninterrupted in the context of rate changes, albeit there were a number of detailed changes taking place at that particular time. And in fact, there was I recall a review considering some changes back in 2008, and in fact, the ring-fence rate remained at 30% at that time. But I put these slides up to remind us all that the North Sea fiscal regime has changed constantly, and the recent changes shouldn't come as a surprise. And in fact, you know, if you're an international investor, this is one of the things you will look at and continue to look at. And I think it's important as we look forward in terms of encouraging investment that actually we try and move away perhaps from these changes and have a period of stability. So looking at the picture at the 2011 budget, and hopefully you can see the detail of the writing, and really I suppose expanding on one of the slides that Mike put up. So looking at the field life cycle from exploration through to development, production, and decommissioning. After the 2011 budget, we had some incentives throughout the life cycle, 100% allowances for exploration, for development, and in fact for decommissioning. We had some new field allowances, ring-fence expenditure supplements to encourage new entrants, and at the far end, in the context of renewables or other uses for the North Sea, there was work ongoing on change of use. At the same time, we had the announcement of the restriction for decommissioning costs, and I think that's an area I think that, again, in the context of external investors looking at the UK, the principle of not getting full relief for cost against profit does seem does seem uncompetitive by international standards. Now, when we wind forward this picture 18 months, you'll see in green some of the positive things which have been announced and which fill some of those gaps in the life cycle. So in terms of the incentives around tax in the context of a field life cycle, I think these have been expanded, become stronger, and in particular, the ring-fence expenditure supplement, the increase to 10%, I think has major impact on many companies, many new entrants, and importantly, as Mike said, we've got brownfield allowance and the decommissioning tax certainty consultation. Now, a number of those changes, particularly in the field allowance, the brownfield allowance, I think that there's the announcement is very recent. We've had some guidance in terms of how it will work, but actually there's still a lot of questions unanswered in terms of the overall impact and also the precise detail of how it's going to work. The decommissioning tax certainty work, it's ongoing. And in fact, it isn't something that should cost the government treasury anything. And in fact, the costings back in the budget were that this decommissioning tax certainly should bring an extra 1.1 billion of tax revenues in the forecast period. And I think that's particularly positive because I think there's a recognition now that the oil and gas tax regime, if properly stimulated, if properly structured, can bring incremental tax revenues to the government. So I think this is obviously something that industry wanted, but it is something that will generate revenues for the Exchequer. And of course, the 50% relief restriction has now been enacted and remains in place. So all in all, I think it's a positive set of changes. As I said, it will take a bit of time for some of these to come through. Now, I was also asked to give a bit of a comparison in relation to some of the other countries, and I've just picked on very briefly and somewhat predictably on Norway and Netherlands. But I suppose just to draw contrast on a couple of points. In relation to Norway, they do have some very powerful, I think, incentives in relation to exploration and also terminal losses that arise at the end of the activity of a participator in the Norwegian continental shelf. And both of those come with refunds of tax attached to the value of those losses. So I think that a lot of the issues that we face in our system around decommissioning tax certainty or trying to incentivize new entrants through the ring-fence expenditure supplement simply are not there in a system like Norway, where a cash tax refund is available for those losses. And I suppose on Netherlands, again, just picking up on the point, a tax deduction is available for decommissioning costs there based on the provision made in the financial statements. So you don't have to wait until you've actually spent the money. And again, you don't have the same risk of, for example, PRT abolition. But actually, so again, some of the discussions we're having here in the UK just simply wouldn't be the case in the Netherlands. So on field allowances, what we try to do here is just to represent the picture geographically. So this is we picked the data from the DEC website, and the fields coloured in yellow are the ones where the field allowances are available, and you can see obviously the west of Shetland allowances, the small fields, and the southern North Sea gas field as well. I mean, these represent, according to the DEC website, there were over 30 fields that have qualifying for field allowances, and now that's out of a total, I guess, of over something like 400. So it is having an impact, and it impacts a significant number of fields, but it's not the allowances are not yet prevalent right across the North Sea. But what I do think it means is that in the context of effective rates for fields, we're now moving towards a regime which is much more bespoke for particular fields. So what I've tried to do here is to almost just set out at a very high level the effective rates for different sorts of fields. And obviously for PRT fields, well, we're still at between 62 and 81%. The position hasn't changed. With the brownfield allowance and the potential reduction of the supplementary charge, we now have fields that could be subject to PRT, corporate tax, but actually be exempt from the supplementary charge. So the rate, I think, will vary between 30% and 81%. And of course, we have the fields at 62%, which are non-PRT, and then those which non-PRT but qualify for the field allowance being between 30 and 62. So if you're looking at headline rates, which is always a dangerous thing without looking at the details and the fundamentals, I think this is a picture that I think quite nicely summarizes where some of these fields might be. But obviously, you need to do the detailed work to understand the exact picture. Now, moving on to just some thoughts on the tax system so far it relates to transactions, because obviously enabling transactions to take place efficiently is vitally important. There's been lots of work done to show that fields moving to new players, to smaller players, result in incremental investment and extension of field lives. So having a flexible system in the context of transaction is, I think, very important. And I think we do have that. We have an exemption for sales of shares, which gives a complete exemption, and actually, importantly, from 2009, reinvestment relief, which provides complete exemption, providing that the proceeds are reinvested back in the UK continental shelf. So I think those two reliefs in particular give a lot of flexibility for allowing deals to happen. However, at the same time, I think there's some areas which require work. I mean, we I think all understand about the decommissioning security and currently being provided on a pre-tax basis. If that can be changed to post-tax basis, a lot of good things will happen, and Mike has covered them already. So that's obviously an area that can be improved in the context of structuring deals. And then also I mentioned another recent change which impacted particularly companies that had held over certain deferred gains. We had I think a somewhat slightly surprising confirmation that the supplementary charge applies to capital gains. And I guess the way it was done suggested retrospective taxation, but I mean it's a point that I know some companies were particularly unhappy about. In the context of decommissioning the security, I mean that is something that will come through over time. The consultation obviously closes in the end of next week. The legislation is due. Draft legislation before Christmas, hopefully with enactment in the course of the Budget and Finance Act next year. So the earliest that decommissioning security deeds will be signed will be following royal assent next year. Again, it will take quite some time for those to feed through in the context of real transactions, and that. So I think 2013, towards the end of second half 2013, is when we're going to really start seeing the impact of that come through. Just one final point around the tax system and how it impacts oil and gas investment. We've talked a lot about the UK continental shelf, but outside the UKCS, the government has been at pains to try and make the system, the international system, much more attractive in the context of UK being a holding company location. And I think that is an important development for the oil and gas industry, because it encourages oil and gas activity internationally to be held via UK. And I think that again means that teams based in London, Aberdeen, and around the UK have more opportunity, and there's more of an incentive for those teams to be involved in international oil and gas. So many clients I work with are actually looking at the UK, using UK companies to make investments around the world, and tax is a helpful aspect, but actually in many cases it's for legal reasons. It's the investment treaty protection that the UK gives you as a consequence of that. And I suppose a related point here is that a number of companies in the oilfield services sector have relocated to the UK in the context of the headquarters, the top company, as a result of these changes. So just concluding, around complexity, I mean, I think there is a lot of complexity, and that is a picture of the legislation, the tax legislation as it stands. There's an enormous amount of books and a very unscientific comparison in terms of the oil and gas legislation. I think the oil legislation is about a tenth of this, and much of that is PRT. So there is obviously complexity, but I think complexity can be worked through and understood. And I think certainly the current working groups around decommissioning are illustrating that. There is a lot of complexity, but it's being worked through. But what people do want is stability. So in conclusion, confidence appears to be returning. I think the recent changes have had an impact, and there's obviously a lot of evidence in that, with drilling and deal activity up for the second quarter this year. I think the tax regime is becoming a bit more bespoke for fields. There's a lot of work remains to be done, and the recent changes will take some time to feed through. But at the same time, I think you need to allow those changes to come through, because otherwise you can't see the impact. So I think a period of stability in the context of the regime is also required. Thank you.